The Daniels household was nothing short of a fortress of love and abundance, a place where laughter bounced off polished walls, and the aroma of fresh meals seemed to announce the wealth and joy within. In the center of it all stood Chief Obinna, Ikenna's father, a man whose name commanded respect in the entire region. He was more than a businessman. He was a builder of dreams, the kind who transformed a single lorry into a fleet of transport companies that crisscrossed the state, and who turned neglected farmlands into thriving estates that fed countless families. Wherever his presence was felt, order followed. Whenever his voice was heard, authority wrapped itself around his words. Yet, behind the sternness of a man who managed fleets and governed acres of farmland, there was a softness he reserved for his son Ikenna and for the young friend who had become like a second child in the home, Chuka. Every evening after returning from his office, Chief Obinna would drive past the compound gate in his silver Prado, step out still in his Agbada, and the first thing he did was drop his briefcase, spread his arms wide, and catch Ikenna in an embrace strong enough to make the boy laugh until his sides hurt. Beside them, Chuka lingered with a shy grin until Chief Obinna reached out and ruffled his hair as well, saying, "What belongs to my son belongs to his brother too." The compound itself reflected Obinna's success. Rows of mango trees lined the driveway. Servants hurried about with trays of fruit and chilled drinks, and the family's laughter poured out of large windows that overlooked flower beds trimmed with care. Neighbors often whispered that fortune had kissed the Daniels too sweetly, that nothing could shake the foundation of such a family. But inside those walls, wealth was not the crown jewel. It was love, discipline, and the bond of people who believed they had everything they would ever need. But in that same house lived another presence, one who wore silk wrappers and jewelry that sparkled under chandeliers but whose heart beat to a colder rhythm. She was Ikenna's stepmother, the woman Chief Obinna had married after tragedy struck years earlier when Ikenna's real mother died. The boy had been only 7 then, his memories of her a fragile mixture of lullabies and soft hands wiping his tears. Her absence left a hollow space in his young life, a space Obinna tried to fill by remarrying. At first, the new wife had seemed like a blessing. She was younger, strikingly beautiful, and knew how to carry herself with grace at social gatherings. But to Ikenna, she was always distant, her words clipped, her gaze lingering too long on the wealth that surrounded them rather than on the child left motherless. She played the role of dutiful wife flawlessly before guests, pouring drinks with a smile and adjusting her husband's collar like an angel of the home. But in private her eyes were calculating, her tone sharp, and her warmth reserved only for the luxuries her position gave her. "You are your mother's son," she would sometimes say, lips curling into a half smile that felt like a dagger cloaked in silk. Chuka once whispered to Ikenna that he didn't trust her, that the way she looked at them was the way a hawk studied chicks in the open field, waiting for the mother hen to look away. But Ikenna brushed it off, believing that no matter her coldness, family was family, and his father's presence was strong enough to protect them all. What the boy didn't know was that her silence was not weakness, it was patience, and patience has sharp teeth when it waits too long. Life in those days had a rhythm so sweet that even the simplest mornings felt painted with gold. Ikenna, tall for his age with eyes sharp like his father's, attended one of the best schools in the city, where classes were held in air-conditioned halls and field trips included excursions to the capital. Chuka, though not from a wealthy family, was never left behind. Chief Obinna had insisted that his son's best friend deserved the same opportunities, so he covered his fees too. After school, the boys would race each other down the driveway, tossing their bags aside and rushing to the stables where a few horses grazed lazily. On weekends, the family dined together under the gazebo, Obinna telling stories of his early days of struggle, how he once sold cola nuts at a motor park before fate lifted him. He would look at Ikenna then, his hand heavy on the boy's shoulder, and say, "The world is wide, my son, but your name must travel even wider." The boy carried those words in his heart like scripture, never imagining that life would soon put them to the test in ways more brutal than any parable his father could tell. Evenings ended with the 3 of them, Obinna, Ikenna, and Chuka, playing Ludo on the veranda while his stepmother pretended to smile from a distance, humming songs as though she were part of the piece. The boy often thought the stars above their house must shine brighter than anywhere else, for no night seemed dark in the Daniels compound, and no morning came without hope stretched across the sky. And then, like lightning tearing the sky open without warning, it all ended. The morning had begun like any other, with the aroma of yam porridge drifting from the kitchen and the sound of Chuka's laughter echoing from the corridor. But before noon, the gates that once welcomed joy were flooded with mourners. A call had come from the highway, an accident, they said, a fatal one. Chief Obina's silver Prado lay in ruins by the roadside, its once proud frame twisted like paper, its windows shattered like broken dreams. The man who had carried a household on his shoulders was gone in the space of a heartbeat, his voice silenced forever. By evening, the compound that once sang with laughter was filled with cries that clawed at the soul. Ikenna's knees buckled. Chuka clung to him like an anchor in a storm, and the boy felt the world tilt under his feet as though the ground itself had betrayed him. Somewhere in the crowd, his stepmother's wail pierced the air, long and loud, but behind her veil, her eyes gleamed not with grief, but with the glint of a storm long waiting to break. That night, as silence fell heavy over the household, Ikenna lay awake, staring at the ceiling that seemed too wide, too cold. He didn't yet know it, but the golden days were gone, and the storm was at the door. The house that had once echoed with laughter was suddenly filled with whispers, footsteps, and the rustle of papers as men in long caftans and women in heavy head ties flooded the living room. They were the relatives, uncles who rarely visited when Chief Obina was alive, aunties whose faces were unfamiliar, and in the middle of them all, the stepmother now draped in widow's black, her voice trembling with a grief that felt rehearsed. "We must settle matters quickly," she declared, clutching her chest like the weight of responsibility had fallen solely upon her. But her eyes betrayed her, sharp, restless, darting from one corner of the mansion to another, as though already counting what would soon be hers. The lawyer, a frail man with tired spectacles, cleared his throat as the children and neighbors waited for words that might bring clarity. His hands shook as he shuffled documents, his voice faltering. "Unfortunately, Chief left no written will," he said at last, his gaze lowering as though ashamed. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the sound of Chuka's sharp intake of breath. Ikenna's heart pounded. It didn't make sense. His father was a man of structure, a man who planned even the smallest detail of their lives. The boy stepped forward, his voice trembling but bold. "That's not true. My father always said he was keeping everything safe for me. He planned everything." But before his words could settle, his stepmother spun toward him, her face twisted in mock pity. "You?" she spat, her voice laced with venom. "Who are you to speak here? You are just the son of a dead woman. This house, this wealth, this legacy, it belongs to me and to those who truly matter." Gasps rippled through the room, but no one rose to defend him. Instead, the uncles nodded, their eyes glittering with greed, their hands already brushing the leather chairs and polished tables like scavengers circling prey. One of them, a man with a belly that entered the room before the rest of his body, stepped forward and smirked. "Boy, you are 16. What do you own? What do you understand about business, about land, about transport fleets? These things now fall to us, the elders." His words slashed at Ikenna's pride, but what cut deeper was the sight of his stepmother standing tall behind them, her lips pressed into a satisfied smile. In one swift motion, she turned to the guards at the door and gave a single nod. That was all it took. Moments later, the children's clothes were flung outside, tossed carelessly into the dust like garbage. Shoes, books, even the little Ludo board they once played on with their father, all scattered. Neighbors peered over fences, whispering behind palms, shaking their heads in pity yet doing nothing. "You have no place here," the stepmother hissed, her voice rising now with authority she had long craved. "Your father is gone, and so is your protection. Go and join your mother in the grave if you wish, but do not remain under this roof." Tears stung Ikenna's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He tightened his fists, his voice breaking but defiant. "This is my father's house. You cannot drive us out," she laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Watch me." And with that, the great iron gate swung shut behind them, the metallic clang ringing louder than any gunshot. The night that followed was one Ikenna would never forget. The world that had once seemed so vast and welcoming shrank into a narrow strip of road outside the mansion where he stood clutching a small bag, Chuka beside him, both of them trembling not just from the cold but from the weight of abandonment. The house loomed behind them, windows glowing warm with light, voices drifting from inside where feasts were now being shared on the very dining table they once gathered around. But outside they were shadows, unwanted, discarded, forgotten. Chuka turned to him, eyes red with unshed tears. "What will we do now?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Ikenna looked up at the night sky, trying to find strength in the stars his father once told him were brighter above their home. But now, those stars seemed to mock him, their brightness too far away to offer warmth. He thought of his late mother, of her soft hands and quiet prayers, and wished desperately that she were here to guide him. But all he had was Chuka, the boy who refused to let him face the storm alone. They tried knocking at relatives' doors that night, moving from one compound to another, explaining, pleading, begging for shelter. But doors closed swiftly, voices snapped coldly. "We cannot get involved. The elders have spoken. Go away before you bring trouble to our house." By the time the last gate slammed in their faces, the boys understood. They were truly alone. They dragged their small belongings through streets that no longer felt familiar, their footsteps heavy, their shadows long under the dim streetlights. At first, they sought refuge at a church, its iron gates locked but its walls promising safety. A guard appeared, torchlight flashing in their faces, and with a growl, chased them away. They tried a market stall next, curling on the hard wooden benches, but mosquitoes and hunger tormented them till dawn. Chuka coughed into his arm, shivering despite the heat, while Ikenna sat upright, sleepless, staring into the darkness as if daring it to swallow him whole. He remembered his father's words. "The world is wide, my son, but your name must travel even wider." Those words mocked him now, ringing in his head as he clutched the last of his belongings, a small worn book his father once gave him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but as he held Chuka's shoulder and whispered, "I won't let us die like this," a fire sparked faintly within him. It wasn't hope yet, it was anger, raw and sharp, the kind that turns into resolve. And as the sun broke slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Ikenna realized that the golden days of laughter were buried forever. Ahead lay a journey of hunger, humiliation, and endless nights on the streets. But he would endure, because there was no other choice. Lagos did not care that Ikenna and Chuka were only boys. The city's veins pulsed with yellow buses roaring for passengers, hawkers screaming prices, beggars dragging plastic bowls from car window to car window. The streets moved forward with no pause, no sympathy, no hand stretched toward two children carrying bags too small for their burden. For weeks, the boys wandered with no roof to call their own, no bed to rest their tired bodies, no comfort except the stubborn closeness that kept them from collapsing. They tried sleeping in corners of the market, only to be chased out by traders wielding sticks. They lay under bridges where the stench of urine and smoke clung to their clothes, mosquitoes feasting on their bare arms. Nights were the cruelest endless stretches of hunger where their stomachs growled louder than the traffic, and their eyes burned with tears they refused to shed. Chuka often asked, "Do you think your father can see us from heaven?" And Ikenna, though uncertain, always forced himself to nod. "He can," he would say, his voice steady though his heart trembled. "And that's why we must not break." It was that promise, repeated night after night, that kept them moving when their legs felt too heavy to lift. Survival came in fragments, carved from humiliation and sweat. They carried loads in the market, straining under sacks of yam and baskets of tomatoes that cut into their skin, while traders shouted, "Move fast, useless boys," and paid them coins barely enough for a meal. Sometimes they polished shoes for strangers, bowing so low their knees bruised against the concrete. Other times, when hunger raged too fiercely, they begged, stretching hands that trembled more from shame than starvation. Some days they ate, some days they drank only water and pretended it was enough. Ikenna's mother was gone, his father buried, but in the spaces between despair, the boy found a new role forced upon him: provider, protector, brother. Chuka fell ill once, fever making his body shake under the heat of Lagos sun, and Ikenna tore through the streets begging for medicine. When he returned with nothing but a small loaf of bread bought with their last of 100, he broke it in half, pressed one piece into Chuka's hand, and said, "Eat, and tomorrow we fight again." They chewed slowly, each bite heavy with the taste of desperation, but they smiled faintly at each other, because sharing made the hunger easier to bear. Time blurred into survival. Weeks folded into months, and months into years, but the struggle never softened. They learned to dodge angry bus drivers who slapped them when they stumbled as conductors. They learned to run fast when market boys accused them of stealing food they hadn't touched. Their shoulders grew harder, their palms calloused, their bodies lean from constant toil. They grew not as ordinary teenagers, but as boys sharpened by suffering, their laughter rare, their eyes too old for their age. Yet through all the cruelty, their bond thickened. Chuka refused to leave Ikenna's side, even when relatives offered him scraps of help if he abandoned his friend. "What use is bread without a brother to share it?" he had shouted, and Ikenna never forgot it. Together, they built rituals to stay human in a world trying to break them. Prayers whispered before sleep on bare cement floors, dreams spoken aloud as if saying them might one day make them real. "We will have a house again," Ikenna would declare. And not just a house, a home. Chuka would grin through cracked lips and add, "And food so plenty, we'll waste some by accident." The promise of a future they had not yet seen became the fuel that dragged them through each new dawn. But even the strongest promises bent under the weight of endless suffering. One night, after a long day of carrying loads for traders who cursed them more than they paid, the boys curled up in front of a locked shop, their bodies weak with hunger. Chuka's voice came low, almost a whisper. "Maybe this is all we'll ever be, street rats." The words stabbed Ikenna, but he didn't rebuke his friend. Instead, he lifted his head, eyes burning at the sight of the moon, framed between crumbling rooftops. He remembered his father's words again. "The world is wide, my son, but your name must travel even wider." That night, something shifted. He realized that if they continued as they were, begging scraps, waiting for mercy, they would die nameless in the gutters. But if they endured long enough, worked harder than pain itself, maybe, just maybe, they could carve a new destiny. He turned to Chuka, his voice firm though his throat was dry. "We may be rats today, but tomorrow we will own the ground these people walk on. Mark my words." And though the hunger still gnawed at their insides, Chuka smiled faintly and whispered, "Then tomorrow better hurry." It was a vow sealed not in ink or paper, but in the raw ache of survival, and in years to come that vow would prove stronger than any inheritance ever stolen. Hope did not arrive in one grand gesture. It crept in slowly, disguised as opportunity too small for most to notice. After months of carrying loads in the market, Ikenna and Chuka had saved coins here and there, hiding them inside a rusted tin can buried beneath a broken plank in the uncompleted building they sometimes slept in. It was not much, barely enough to buy bread and beans for a week, but it was theirs, earned through sweat, insults, and blistered palms. One evening, as they counted their pitiful savings under the dim light of a flickering lantern, a thought sparked in Ikenna's mind. What if we stop carrying loads for people and carry ourselves into something bigger? Chuka frowned, his young face hardened by skepticism. "Bigger how? We don't even have shoes that can last another week." But Ikenna's eyes glowed with a fire that hunger could not dim. The next day, he approached a man who leased out okadas, pleading for a chance to rent one with their small savings. At first, the man laughed. "What can two hungry rats do with a motorbike?" But desperation has a way of breaking down walls. With persistence, and a promise to pay double if given time, the man finally agreed. That evening, they wheeled their first okada into the narrow alley they called home. The paint scratched, the seat torn, but to them it gleamed like gold. Chuka took the handles, his hands trembling not with fear, but with the weight of new responsibility. Ikenna placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ride for both of us," he said. "I will manage the money, and together we will multiply this." For the first time in years, the boys felt something different from pain. It was possibility, fragile but alive. The road to survival did not instantly become smooth. Chuka's first weeks as a rider were brutal. Danfo drivers cursed him for being too slow, passengers sneered at his tattered clothes, and area boys demanded tax each time he passed certain corners. Some days, he returned with bruises from fights he could not win. But every night, Ikenna waited, notebook in hand, recording each naira earned, stretching the little they made into food, fuel, and savings. They ate gari with groundnuts most nights, drank water to trick their stomachs into fullness, and patched the bike with borrowed tools when it coughed smoke. They starved often, but they never touched the savings tin unless it was to add something inside. "Better we suffer today than starve tomorrow," Ikenna would insist whenever Chuka suggested spending extra. Slowly, the coins became notes, and the notes grew thicker, until one morning they stood before the same man who once mocked them and slapped down enough cash to buy the bike outright. His eyes widened. "You mean you boys paid this from the street?" Ikenna nodded, his voice steady. "From the street, but for the future." Owning that bike was more than a purchase. It was proof that hunger had not killed their will, and with ownership came growth. Within a year, their single okada turned into 2, then 3. Chuka rode one, a hired boy rode another, and Ikenna oversaw it all, waking before dawn to calculate expenses, chasing after mechanics, bargaining with petrol sellers. They worked like men possessed, fueled not by greed but by the memory of the night they were thrown out like trash. Every sound of coins dropping into their tin was a reminder that they were climbing, inch by inch, out of the pit. The breakthrough was not only financial, it was emotional. With their growing income, Ikenna finally dared to think beyond survival. His first thought was of his mother, the woman who once sang him lullabies before death stole her away too soon. Though she was gone, her absence had left a wound that the stepmother's cruelty deepened. But he still had a responsibility to the living, and his heart turned toward Chuka's family, who were drowning in poverty too. Quietly, without telling his friend, he began setting aside money for Chuka's younger siblings to return to school. When he revealed it months later, handing Chuka the admission receipts, the boy broke down in tears, clutching him like a brother by blood. "Why would you do this for me?" Chuka asked, his voice shaking. Ikenna smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "Because when I had no family, you chose to be mine." From that day, their bond became iron, unbreakable. They made a pact. Every step forward would be together, every victory shared, every burden halved, and forward they went. After okadas came tricycles, after tricycles came buses, until their small business became a fleet scattered across busy Lagos roads. People who once hissed at them in the market now tipped their hats when they passed. The same traders who had mocked their blistered hands now called them oga with forced respect. But the boys did not forget the gutter nights or the taste of hunger. Every naira spent was carefully weighed, every expansion calculated with the memory of those early insults carved into their skin. Years melted away, carrying with them scars and lessons, until the boys who once begged under bridges stood as young men, their backs straighter, their voices deeper, their hands steady with the weight of responsibility. By the time Ikenna turned 25, he and Chuka no longer counted coins. They counted routes, drivers, and weekly returns. Their small office, tucked behind a mechanic workshop, buzzed with drivers reporting earnings, passengers queuing for buses marked with their logo, and receipts piled on desks. Yet, in the midst of their success, sacrifice remained their foundation. They still lived humbly, ate modest meals, and worked longer than the men they employed. And through all this, one truth never left Ikenna's mind. They had not survived just to own bikes or buses. They had survived to prove that betrayal could not define destiny. Still, on quiet nights when the city finally hushed, Ikenna often lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their small rented room, whispering to himself, "We are only at the beginning." For though their suffering had birthed growth, he knew the world had not yet seen the full measure of their rise. And somewhere, beyond the glow of streetlights and the hum of distant generators, fate prepared its next chapter, one that would bring both justice and reckoning to those who once cast them out. By the time a full 20 years had passed, the names Ikenna and Chuka were no longer whispered with pity in market corners, but spoken with admiration in boardrooms and motor parks alike. What began with a battered okada had grown into a transport empire that stretched across the state. Fleets of buses painted in blue and white, each marked with the bold initials IC Transports. Men who once spat insults at them in the dust now saluted when they drove past in convoys. The boys who once chased coins in the market had become employers of hundreds, commanding respect not through inherited titles but through grit and sacrifice. Their office complex, a 2-story building overlooking a bustling highway, buzzed with dispatch riders, clerks, and drivers awaiting instructions. Inside, Ikenna sat behind a polished desk, his once thin frame now broad, his voice carrying the weight of authority as he mapped new routes, signed contracts, and met with partners eager to align with his vision. Beside him, Chuka remained the same loyal force, his laughter still quick, his courage still unshaken, though his suits now matched the color of his ambition. They were more than friends. They were brothers carved by suffering, partners whose bond was stronger than blood, proof that resilience could build dynasties where privilege had failed. Together, they were not just survivors, they were builders, leaders, and symbols of what the street could create when loyalty held firm. But while the two men rose, the woman who had once mocked them fell with a speed as merciless as the cruelty she once showed. Ikenna's stepmother, once draped in silk and dripping with gold, now shuffled through life wrapped in faded wrappers, her beauty shriveled by bitterness. Her children, those she once boasted would inherit their father's legacy, had squandered her wealth faster than rain soaking into dry sand. They fought over land, sold off properties for cheap pleasures, and abandoned her when the money dried up. Nights that once echoed with the clink of glasses and the hum of generators now rang with silence and coughs. The mansion she once guarded so fiercely was stripped of furniture, its grand chandelier covered in cobwebs, its gates rusting under the weight of neglect. Neighbors whispered when they passed, "Is this not the same woman who chased her stepson into the street?" Karma had sharpened its claws and now feasted slowly, stripping her dignity one layer at a time. When sickness came, an illness that bent her back and drained her strength, she found no child by her side, no relative willing to help. The same uncles who once stood with her in greed had either died in disgrace or vanished into poverty, leaving her with nothing but memories that stung sharper than hunger. And each time she coughed into the silence, she remembered the clang of the gate the day she threw Ikenna out, and realized too late that the sound had been the bell of her own downfall. The contrast was starkest on the streets, where buses carrying the bold letters IC Transports roared past her crumbling neighborhood. Children she once would have scorned now looked up at billboards bearing Ikenna's face, his sharp eyes and confident stance, announcing new expansions of his company into neighboring states. Chuka too had become a figure of admiration, known for his fearless leadership and the way he never let his brother face the storm alone. Together, they sponsored schools for orphans, provided scholarships for street children, and built small shelters in neighborhoods that once rejected them. When asked why, Ikenna always gave the same answer: "Because I know what it feels like to have nothing." Their compassion made their empire more than a business. It became a lifeline, a symbol of restoration. Meanwhile, the stepmother drifted in the opposite direction, her pride crumbling like the walls of the house she once ruled. She begged for scraps in markets where her stepson now commanded fleets, her voice hoarse, her hands trembling, her eyes downcast when drivers wearing icy uniforms passed. Sometimes she heard people whisper, if only she had loved those boys instead of hating them. Those words pierced deeper than hunger, for they reminded her of a truth she had buried under greed. Love could have saved her, but hatred had destroyed her. And then came the day when their paths crossed again. Ikenna and Chuka, now men of influence, were invited to a community gathering to inaugurate a new motor park they had built. Crowds filled the dusty square, music blaring, officials applauding. In the middle of the celebration, a frail figure pushed through the crowd, her wrapper dragging in the dirt, her eyes wild with desperation. Gasps erupted as people recognized her, the once proud wife of Chief Ikenna, now reduced to a shadow. She staggered forward until she collapsed at Ikenna's feet, clutching his shoes, her voice breaking with sobs. "Forgive me," she cried, her tears soaking the ground. "Forgive me, my son. I was blind, foolish, consumed by greed. Look at me now. I have nothing. My own children have left me to rot. I beg you, don't let me die like this." The square fell silent, every eye fixed on Ikenna, waiting to see how he would respond. Chuka placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, Ikenna stood frozen, memories flooding his mind. The clang of the gate, the hunger, the humiliation, the night spent under bridges. The boy inside him wanted to turn away, to let her drown in the same misery she had fed him. But the man he had become knew better. Slowly, he bent down, lifted her trembling hands from his feet, and spoke in a voice steady with restraint. "I cannot erase what you did. You threw me into the street and called me nothing. But I will not be like you. I will not let hatred guide me. Stand up and face the life you chose. My forgiveness is yours, but my trust is gone." The crowd erupted, some in shock, others in awe. And as the stepmother wept into her palms, the lesson was carved into every watching heart. Greed may steal riches, but it can never steal destiny. The storm that began with betrayal did not end with the stepmother's tears. Fate, like a patient hunter, had one final arrow to release. It came years later, in the form of an aging man with weary eyes and trembling hands, a former business partner of Chief Ikenna who had carried a secret like a stone pressing on his chest. One afternoon, he appeared at Ikenna's office unannounced, clutching a leather folder that looked older than its owner. He bowed low, his voice cracking as he spoke. "My son, forgive me for coming so late. I should have spoken years ago, but fear chained my tongue. Your father, he left a will. He left everything to you, but your stepmother and her brothers bribed me to keep it hidden." The room fell silent, the air heavy with shock. Chuka stiffened, his fists clenching at his side. Ikenna's jaw tightened, a storm raging behind his calm expression. The man opened the folder with trembling fingers, revealing brittle papers stamped and signed with Obina's bold hand. Every detail was there: the transport companies, the farmlands, the estates, all written in Ikenna's name. "I have lived in guilt," the man continued, tears running down his cheeks. "I have watched you rise from nothing when all along your inheritance was locked away. But I cannot carry this shame to my grave. I am ready to testify." In that moment, the years of hunger, humiliation, and endless nights under bridges flashed before Ikenna's eyes, not as defeat, but as proof that destiny could be delayed but never denied. The revelation lit a fire that spread quickly. Within weeks, lawyers filed cases, newspapers caught wind, and the story of a hidden will dominated headlines. Stepson fights for father's empire screamed across front pages, fueling public outrage. The courtroom became a stage, packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and murmuring spectators. On one side sat Ikenna and Chuka, their suits pressed, their gazes firm, their very presence a testimony of survival and success. On the other side, the stepmother and her allies, their faces pale, their eyes darting nervously as the tide of judgment rose against them. Witness after witness spoke, drivers who remembered Obina's words, clerks who had seen the documents, and finally, the partner who confessed with a voice heavy with regret. Each testimony carved away the lies that had buried the truth. The will was presented, its ink faded but its authority shining brighter than gold. When the judge's gavel finally struck, the hall erupted. The court hereby recognizes Ikenna Obina as the rightful heir to his father's estate. All property seized are to be returned immediately. Those found guilty of fraud and concealment shall face the full weight of the law. Gasps, shouts, even sobs filled the air. The stepmother collapsed into her chair, her wails echoing like a dirge. The same relatives who once strutted proudly in stolen wealth now hung their heads as police led them away, their names forever stained. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. Yet victory did not taste as sweet as Ikenna once imagined. When the banks released the accounts, when the deeds were signed back in his name, when the mansions and farmlands once stolen now stood legally his, he did not feel the rush of triumph but the weight of reflection. He and Chuka sat late into the night, the documents spread across their desk, the glow of success dimmed by memory. "We already built an empire without these," Chuka muttered, tapping the papers with disdain. "This is not who we are anymore." Ikenna nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the window where the city lights blinked like distant stars. "Our wealth was never in land or buses. It was in loyalty, in survival, in the promise that we would never break. These papers are proof of justice, but they are not our crown." Still, he accepted them, not as treasures to hoard but as tools to heal. The same hands that once trembled with hunger now signed checks for schools, hospitals, and shelters. The inheritance that greed tried to bury became the foundation of restoration, not revenge. Ikenna named the foundation after his father, not as a monument of wealth, but as a reminder that legacies are not measured by possessions, but by lives transformed. And so, the story closed not in bitterness, but in rebirth. The stepmother faded into obscurity, her cries drowned by the laughter of children in orphanages funded by the Daniels Foundation. Relatives who once sneered at Ikenna's suffering now whispered his name with awe, ashamed to meet his eyes in public. Chuka, forever by his side, became co-director of the empire, his name etched into every success as a brother, not just a friend. Together they built a future brighter than even Chief Obina had dreamed, a future carved not from gold, but from scars turned into strength. On the day the Foundation's first school opened, Ikenna stood before hundreds of children, some barefoot, some abandoned, all hungry for hope, and his voice carried like thunder. "I once slept under bridges. I once begged for scraps. But I did not die there, and neither will you. We are proof that the street does not have the final say. Love does. Loyalty does. Faith does." The crowd erupted, applause thundering against the sky, but Ikenna's eyes lifted higher beyond the noise toward the heavens. He pictured his father, his late mother, smiling down, their legacy alive in every child who would never know the hunger he once endured. And in that moment, he knew the truth. Revenge had never been the goal. Restoration was. What greed had tried to destroy, love had rebuilt stronger. And in the end, that was the only inheritance worth keeping.